So I'm Regan Murray. I'm a student researcher for the MRC project, and I'm also a history major in my junior year here at Cornell. I think as a history major, I try to be connected to resistance in the sense of choosing topics to study and fields to study, parts of the world, people who don't get a lot of visibility in traditional academic sort of old white man's history. So I've taken Africana studies courses, Latin American studies courses, and try and find the histories of women, histories of people of color. I'm probably going to get my PhD, that's the plan right now, and become a historian. And I think I want to do that because there's so many stories out there that are not told about people and about the resistance of Western, white-dominated, male power structures. And those are important histories to tell. So I think there are a lot of ways in academia we can be connected to resistance that we might not acknowledge as much, and history is one of those. I think artists, they change the way we see the world a lot of the times. An artist is presenting us a certain image of the world, a certain way of seeing things. They're often interceding on a power structure that has kind of constructed this one narrative and this one way of seeing. I mean, that's a lot of what power is and oppression is creating this one way of viewing the world and forcing everyone to adhere to that. So an artist can, by breaking from that one narrative, really give us a way of seeing behind the curtain of what is oppressing us. So I chose Perla de Leon's My Playground, which is a black and white photograph of a young girl playing in the South Bronx. And De Leon took it in 1977 when she was a teacher in the South Bronx. And that period is referred to historically as the urban crisis. So 1960s to 1970s in cities, you had an increasing number of white people who had social mobility moving out of the city into the suburbs. And that started to feed into an economic collapse and decline of the neighborhoods. And mostly the people who were left were people of color who didn't have the social mobility to move out of those neighborhoods. And that lack of social mobility has its own historical legacy in what's known kind of colloquially as redlining. So that was a practice that was both government supported and supported by banks of not extending mortgages to people of color, and then also simultaneously categorizing city districts and grading them. And the worst graded neighborhoods were red neighborhoods, and people of color weren't given mortgages. They ended up living in red line neighborhoods, and red line neighborhoods were defined by the presence of people of color. So if a person of color moved into a neighborhood, that neighborhood would get downgraded and eventually become a red neighborhood. So it was so racialized. And the result was these neighborhoods of people of color who didn't have financial capital and means of moving out of the city. So then when all these white people started moving out of the city, you have these isolated neighborhoods of color that don't have any money, don't have any capital, and they actually started getting burned down by the landlords, because once it was no longer profitable for the landlords to rent out those apartments and they started getting abandoned, they just burned them down. So anyhow, it's this really dramatic landscape that De Leon is part of in the late 70s in the Bronx. And it's also a landscape that a lot of white photographers and white writers are dealing with at the time, and really focusing on the destitution and the desolation of the landscape rather than the people. And so De Leon really wanted to show that even in this desolate landscape, you still had vibrant communities. So the people who were living in these communities were not reflecting the same desolation of the landscape. I mean, these were resilient people. And several artists of color were working independently at this time in the Bronx and other boroughs of the city. And that was put together, their work was put in an exhibit called Down These Mean City Streets last year, or I believe in 2017. And of the artists who participated, she was the only woman. And another interesting thing about her work is her interest in children. She felt like children were particularly emblematic of resilience and resistance. Hence, you get this image of this little girl playing in this burned out neighborhood and kind of the defiance to keep playing and to stay strong. I think I have right now focused on tailoring my studies towards kind of resistance and going out of my way to take Africana Studies classes, Latin American Studies classes that unfortunately aren't mandated by Cornell's curriculum right now, but I think are really important. I think my interest is predominantly right now in looking at history and looking at it from different angles and realizing that the male white dominated narrative we have of it is really limiting in terms of how we imagine ourselves and our world. But obviously there are other ways that a person can engage in resistance and activism, and as your life develops, you might pick up a few more ways of engaging in that. I think art education kind of fundamentally resists traditional academia. I think it's often marginalized in its own right as like a field of legitimate study. So that's one foundation of resistance that's sort of embedded within it. And also, if you look at art, just the wealth of creators of art, you can get a lot more perspectives than if you're looking at published scientific studies or if you're looking at other forms of knowledge production. Art can pull from a lot more diverse creators, and so we get these multifaceted historical narratives. And also I think art, you can trace the interactions between different schools of artists and different works and kind of the impact of different political movements in art in a very engaging way. And so also for thinking about the MRC project, I think having visual media is a way that brings people in to these sorts of discussions, because it's good to have historical context for looking at a work, but you can still look at a work and make a lot of really intelligent observations about what it's saying and also kind of feel personally connected to it, I think, by the visual connection. So having art as the way we're engaging with a theme of resistance really kind of democratizes it and makes it approachable and makes it something that everyone wants to be part of that discussion.